So this is the end, sort of, that you're seeing at the beginning. But it's my way of saying this is where we're going to get to show you how to build your tracks off the tank and then put them on later, with a little bit of painting involved too. So we'll get to it. I'm working on this Rogal Dorn Battle Tank, and I've got most of the hull assembled, but I've left off the tracks because there's several ways that you can assemble the tracks. Certainly you can just do as the instructions show and put them on early in the assembly, glue them on, they're in place, and you just paint them where they sit. And that works. I've done that before. But sometimes, especially if you're going to be using dry brushing or other painting techniques that are a little more not so precise, I guess you'd say, sometimes it can be a little bit of a pain to have to work between the color of the tank and the color of the tracks, especially if they're very different. So I chose not to glue them on in this case. I've seen other methods, and I've done this one time before, where you leave them on the sprue and paint them on the sprue or off the sprue. You can do it either way, but paint them completely separately, disassembled, and then towards the end glue them onto the model. So you've painted the model separately and the tracks separately, then you bring them together, and that works okay too. But sometimes in the assembly, glue can start doing things you don't want it to do. It can get a little fiddly. So that's a method that I've kind of decided I'm not going to do that anymore. What I'm going to show in this video, this one here today, is a method that basically I saw Martin Kovac on Night Shift Scale Models doing on some of his Tamiya tanks, because they have tracks very much like will come in a Games Workshop kit, where you have individual links but also long runs of tracks, and you just kind of assemble them together. And I saw a method that he used, and I want to show you that method because I found it to be very helpful in assembling the tracks, in allowing me to paint them separately off the model, but then assemble them very easily when it's time to add them to the model. Now, when evaluating how I'm going to do a build process like this, I look at the instructions to kind of see how much needs to be built up in order to put the tracks on. For most Warhammer tanks, you can get away with just doing just these side pieces. Most of them have something like that. Not all of them, but essentially there's a point where you can partially build it enough to where you can get the tracks on. Now, in this case, I went ahead and just built out pretty much the entire hull because it'll still work the same. But then I look at what pieces go on in the assembly of the tracks, and I see that there's some long runs of tracks, and then there's some single pieces that need to go on, both front and back. And that's where I make my decision about how I'm going to break it down. Now, generally, when I'm looking at breaking it down, I work from the top around to this front bottom angle, and I do that as one assembly. Then I do this back part down around to the final bend there, and then this piece I can just leave to put on at the end. So it may vary from tank to tank, but you're generally going to come away with, and you'll see what I mean once I start assembling, you're generally going to come away with 2 or 3 sections depending on the tank. I think when I built the Basilisk, if I remember right, that ended up being 2 sections, kind of a top, front, and then a lower back on each side. Now, something that can vary from model to model is whether it has fenders or not. On this Rogal Dorn Battle Tank, the fenders are optional. Now, I plan to use them. I haven't glued them on yet, but I plan to use them. So one thing to keep in mind if you're going to use this method for assembling the tracks is to check to see if the track section itself will slide under the fenders. Now, all I'm going to do here is just hold that in place. And I'm simply going to take this piece of track from right here. This is part number 23. I'm just going to take it. I'm going to see, does it slide under? And it does not. Not really well. Now, that gives me two options. I can either leave the fender off and then add it later after the tracks are on, or I can do some modification to the tracks to make them easier to put in. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this. One would be to use your knife and just cut away the sections of track that are going to be underneath, because you really only need about that much showing. So you could just cut away a little bit of the track that's not needed, and it's going to make that easier to slide up under there. But what I always test first is, can I clip off some of the little guide teeth that are on the bottom, because those are what hold the track in place. But because the track is going to be assembled and we're going to be able to just put it on in one piece, I don't need for all of those guide teeth to be in there. I just need a few points to glue it along the way. So what I'm going to do to test this is I'm going to first snip off some of these guides. And I won't have to do them all, just enough to see, will that allow it to slide under there. Then once I have those snipped off, I just go ahead and sand them smooth with my file. All right, once I have those sanded off smooth, I can just take it and give it a test, and see, slides right in. Now, once it hits the rest of the teeth that are still on there, it's going to stop. But that tells me that I can work with this and get that to slide in at the end, so that's good to go. Now what I want to do is I want to get the sections of track that I'm going to glue together for one area. So I'm going to need part number 23, and from up on this step, part number 16, part number 25, and you have to pay attention. I have to come over here and get part number 7 and part number 9. So you've got to kind of pay attention to the instructions. And what's real important is, as you're getting these parts, that you kind of keep track, no pun intended, of where they are. In other words, I'm going to lay out track piece number 23, and then I'm going to go and find the one that comes next, and that's going to be, let me see, I've already forgotten. That's going to be part number 9, it looks like. So I'm going to get part number 9 and lay it out next, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It's very important that when you're doing tracks with this method, that you keep them in order and keep them oriented correctly. So let me get those parts, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. One other thing I forgot to point out, there are, of course, seam lines along the edges of the tracks. You can clean those off as you take them off of the sprue. You can clean them off once you get them all laid out. You can clean them off after you glue it together. I tend to do kind of a hybrid of all of that. What I do is I use my file to get rid of the nub marks initially, and then once I have them all in place, I just grab it, turn on a good podcast, and sit down with my file and my knife and clean everything out all along the tracks when it's all in one piece. But you do it however works for you. All right, I have the sections laid out that are going to go from this back top portion around and then terminate in this single piece right here, and then they will connect with that long run underneath, which I'm going to leave separate on this model. So I've got all those parts, and I've made sure that I've got them aligned properly. I look at the instructions and I see that, okay, all of them, when it's pointing towards the back, is going to have the 2 linkages at the back and the 3 in the front. So I've made sure they're all aligned just like that, so that I can simply connect them together like this. Now there's a little bit of pressure required because they actually go together. Now this one, because I've cut off the teeth, it's going to fit a little different, but that's okay. So that's dry fitted and ready to go. Now, if in the middle of this process, if you have to get up and go somewhere, like I have to actually get up and go right now to work, simple way to keep everything ready to go for your next session is just to take a piece of tape and put over it like that. And you've got all the parts held in place and ready to go until you return. So I'm fixing to go off to a day's work, and but all you'll see is this fade, and I'll be right back. And just like that, it's the next day. All right, I'm going to take the tape off. Now at this point, I've made sure that I have this section that's kind of out of camera range, this section in the right order. Now what I want to do is flip it over like that. Now once it's flipped over, I'm going to glue the tracks together with some Tamiya extra thin cement. Now you don't have to use Tamiya extra thin, but I would recommend using a thin cement that's a bonding kind of cement, not the tube glue, not the kind of thick, sticky model cement. You want these thin kind of cements. I think Gunza makes some. I believe Ammo of MiG makes some that's similar to this, but Tamiya is what I use and what I highly recommend. And all I'm going to do is just go in. I'm not going to flood it, but I'm just going to put a little into all the joints just to make sure that they get bonded together. Now once I have those together, I'm going to just kind of put my fingers on the top to make sure they don't pop up, and I'm just going to push them together so they get kind of squeezed together. I want them to set a little bit. I want that glue will begin dissolving the plastic, and once it begins dissolving it, when you push it together, it'll start the bonding process. This stuff dries fairly quickly, but you have some working time. Now what I want to do is I want to leave it for maybe just about 3 or 4 minutes. That's all it's going to take. Now at this point, it's always good to kind of orient yourself to the section that you're doing, because when you turn it upside down, I get confused real easily. So I like to remember, okay, which side am I doing? I'm going to be doing this side of it, and it's going to be going from here around to there. So I'm going to flip this over, making sure to keep my eye on that side right here, because that's where I want it to go. Now to make sure I get it aligned right, I'm going to take this track piece that goes on the bottom, and I'm going to set it in place. Now once that's in place and I've got it lined up, what that does is it gives me the correct placement for this end of it, because this is the end that's going to terminate right there. So all I do now is I take that piece and I put it in there, and then I just rotate this around and I bend the tracks around like that. You may have to work with them a little, but once they get in place, and if they start stretching a bit like that, did you see how they kind of got a little disjointed? You just work with them, get them back in place, and you just want to get them set like that. Don't want them too stretched out, but just set like that, just as if you were gluing them in place, but they're not glued in place. They're glued together. Now, as you see, sometimes you got to work with it a little bit. This one doesn't want to cooperate. Sometimes what I've had to do when I do this is pull it back off, re-glue an area because it didn't set well enough, and then put it back on. But right there, that's set in place pretty good. Now all I'll do is I'll put some tape on there to make sure that it holds all the angles. And I'll let that dry, fixing that little gap right there. And I'll let that dry, and after about half an hour, that will be set enough that I can take this off. All right, now you can see that I've got the full length of track done. There's still this bottom piece is not glued on at all, but this piece has been glued together and fit to shape, and this section has been glued together and fit to shape. I'll let them dry. Like I said, I normally give them, you want to give them at least half an hour so they're fairly well set. If you can, let them sit longer than that. I'm going to have to go back to work, so start another work day. So I'll just let these dry all day. But because I glued them and that glue started getting sticky and set and was not runny, it's not going to glue to the model. So it's not stuck there. And if it does get a little piece that's stuck here or there, it's usually very easy to just clip it away, as long as you don't flood the tracks with the thin cement so that there's just large areas of, glue still glopping around. I try to keep it confined to the joints between the tracks right there and not let it get along the outer edges or anything like that. But it'll be enough to hold it. And once this sets, I can take these off, and then I'll show you what I do with them from there. All right, these have dried overnight, and I'm ready to take them off. Now, taking them off is fairly easy. I'm going to start with this piece on the bottom and just lift this piece up here, and it just comes right off. If it does give you a little bit of problem, you can use the tip of your knife. Just kind of go under there and pop it up. But they should come off fairly easily. There's some pretty decent friction grip with these tracks, but it's not hard to get them off of there. Now, there is going to be some flex to them. That's normal. You don't want to flex them too much because you don't want them to lose their shape. There's going to be a little bit of bend to them. And when you put them back on, you'll be able to get them back in shape. So that's normal for there to be just a little bit of that flex. Now, for the last part of this video, I want to do just some base painting on them. Now, obviously, there's going to have to be, a lot of painting done on the tank, painting done on the tracks, then the tracks put onto the tank, and a lot of weathering done. But because this video is focused on the tracks, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I do for the base painting. Now, if you notice on these tracks, hang on, let me refocus my camera. Okay, there, I think I can move things in and out and it'll focus. You'll see that on the tracks here that you've got your metal tread parts right here, like you would expect, but there's also these pads here. Now, on real world tanks, these are generally going to be some kind of hard rubber substance, plastic, something like that. You can interpret it as metal, certainly if you want to, but that it does give for some interesting contrast in terms of the normal tank treads and those pads. And with your Citadel tanks, you're going to find that there's both examples. This that has the pads on it is one way that it's done. Here's a Deimos Rhino that I did a while back, and you can see that the tracks there are presented as just kind of solid metal pieces. So they've got different styles. So the overall painting is going to be about the same, with just the exception of how you handle the pads. Now, most of the time when you see 40K tank treads being painted in videos and, articles and things like that, they almost always start with a coat of some kind of silver, lead belcher or something like that. And that's fine. If you like that look, do it. No problem there. But when I do, when I've seen tank treads in real life, back when I was in the Army and, just observing pictures and videos and things like that, they're very rarely silver. There may be some where it gets scraped a lot, that it scrapes it down to the bare metal, and you may see some there, but it might even be kind of polished and shiny. That's part of the reason that I used graphite on these treads, so that those most raised parts right there would have kind of a metallic sheen to them. But what I like to do is I like to start off with a color that's tannish, reddish, something that's going to look like a light coat of rust and dust. And then I add on some dark metallic chip look to it, and then a little bit of rust, and then later on when I put it on the model itself, then there'll be further weathering put on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few minutes to get all of these mold seam lines cleaned up all around here, and then I'm going to prime it, and I'll show you what I do to paint it. One quick tip I forgot to point out: when I'm working on these tracks, I like to scribe in, at least on one side, some indication of which side it is. Here I'm just going to scribe in a little L, and that way I'll know that that goes on the left side, and I'll do it on all the others. So even if I don't do it on the other side, I'll know which one is the left side, because while some models, they may be interchangeable per side, some of them they're not, and because I've put them on in the manner that I have, I want to make sure they're fitted to the correct side, so that little mark can keep you out of trouble. All right, I got the tracks primed. I use Vallejo rattle can primer. This is Panzer Gray. Nothing special about the color or the primer. I just wanted it to be dark. Didn't want it to be pure black, but just kind of a very, very dark gray, because that looks kind of steely to me. Now I need to get them base painted. Now for the base painting, I'm going to stipple on some Citadel Steel Legion drab that I've thinned about 50-50 with water. And you'll notice that I'm just putting my finger behind it, especially here in these areas where they're glued together, just to give it a little bit of support. There is a little bit of flex there, as I mentioned, and I want to just give those some support. I don't know that I'm going to paint 2 coats on it. I'm going to go back and look at them after they dry up, because when paints are this thin, they tend to go on a little more opaque than they dry. And so I'll look at what I've done and decide if I want to put on another coat or leave it like this. For this, I'm using Rosemary & Co. Extra large dry brush. Now I'm going to dry brush some Carrick stone over that. I ended up stippling on 2 coats of that Steel Legion drab. I decided to go for a little more full coverage rather than spotty coverage. Now I'll paint the track pads with Vallejo German Gray. Now I'm going to do some sponge chipping along the tracks using the same Vallejo German Gray. That way, if I get any on the pads themselves, it won't really matter. For getting in between the links right here, I just switch to this small dry brush and just kind of stipple in some chipping right through there. And start weathering the track pads, making them look worn and distressed. I'm going to use some Vallejo Sky Gray in this small dry brush and just trying to hit the edges of the track pads. Now I'll continue making use of the Sky Gray. I'm just going to sponge on a little bit to each of the track pads, just to the flat surface of it, to make it look scuffed and used and, not like it's brand new or anything like that. Now, as a final step in this, I guess you'd call it base painting. It's a lot of steps for base painting, but hey, why not overcomplicate things? I'm going to rust it up. And for this, I'm going to be using a shade that, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how to say. So I'm using this one. I'm thinking it's not Fuegan orange. Fuegan orange. Fuegan orange. See what I mean? Gotta kind of be careful with it. But whatever it is, it's real good for just imparting a rusty look to stuff. I just go around and put this on around all the bolts. And once it dries on the face, I'll go and do the sides and the other side that's going to be visible. Here you can see this section. This is mostly dry, not completely. You can still see some moisture back in the recesses, but it just gives a basis of some older, worn, chippy kind of tracks. Now, I've still got some work to do. I've been kind of doing this in stages for the purpose of videoing, so I've still got some work to do to get all of them finished off. But I hope this video has given you some ideas, some thoughts on how you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can have the tracks fully assembled, you can paint them while assembled, but still leave them off of the model, because see, I'll be able to paint the model entirely and get all of the painting done, all of the highlighting and shading and shadowing, and maybe even some of the initial weathering, without having to worry about continually touching up the tracks or trying to avoid the tracks. And then at the appropriate point in the build, when I'm doing the overall weathering, I'll be able to put those tracks on and weather everything as one unit, so that it's all a cohesive thing. So it's a simple method, but I like it, and I just found it to be very helpful for me in my own work. Well, be sure and subscribe to this channel so that as you see further videos about building this Rogal Dorn Battle Tank, I plan to have at least 2 more. One about doing all of the painting of the tank itself, and then one for the weathering. I may do a video about painting the crew. I've got a slightly different scheme in mind for not only the tank but for the crew. Still canon, but something that I've had my eye on for a while. So please be sure and subscribe. And thank you for watching this video. I'm grateful. I would appreciate it if you would drop a comment down below if you have some ideas on how you like to do tracks. Leave those down there. I'd like to see them, and others may too. And of course, to all of the folks who support me on Patreon, thank you so much for that support. It's a blessing to me. It's a blessing to my family. So we are very grateful for that support. And if you would like to see how you can support the work that I do, then please take a look at the link down below for Patreon and see what's offered there. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.